Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens.
Hey y'all, we are back with another edition of Coffee with Comrades. This week we share the second half of our two-part series on the secret history of chemistry, featuring Taylor Perry. But before we get there, a couple quick announcements here at the top of the episode. First, Coffee with Comrades is an affiliate of the Rev Left Radio Federation and the Channel Zero Network. Check out this jingle from our homies in Time Talks.
I'm going to make those pompous academics regret kicking out such a genius. Deciding to build my lab and do my research.
The Time Talks Podcast.
Have you ever stared at a 500-page book and wish you could just talk to the author about their ideas instead? If so, the Time Talks Podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network, is for you, where we discuss history, politics, music, and art with an anti-authoritarian and anarchist perspective.
The Time Talks Podcast.
What's this light? I feel different.
The Time Talks Podcast.
Second, Coffee with Comrades is an independent media project that relies on the generosity and the mutual aid of listeners just like you. If you dig this program, if these conversations speak to you, if you've ever learned something listening to Coffee with Comrades, please consider signing up to empower this program by going to www.patreon.com/Coffee with Comrades to become a sustaining supporter for as little as $1 a month. Come hang out with us on Discord, check out our zine, Cold Brew Chronicles, and score some sweet-ass stickers. We now turn to part 2 of our special on the secret history of chemistry. If this is your first time checking out Coffee with Comrades, or you haven't already done so, we recommend you listen to episode 68, Alchemy and Atom Bombs, before you check out this edition of the program. In this episode, we pick up where we last left off, transitioning into a discussion about some of history's most fascinating chemists, including the anarchist who created the periodic table, before discussing the utility of critical thinking in an epoch of untruth. Please enjoy episode 69 of Coffee with Comrades. I critique, therefore I exist.
Dig into it. So, I mean,
hell yeah.
You know, we've already talked a little bit about, like, alchemists, and we can kind of see the transition from this pseudo-scientific, kind of vaguely spiritual journey into a much more refined and specific scientific approach. But I'm kind of curious, like, before we talk about chemists specifically, you know, what are some of the, like, big this question might be kind of obvious, but I'd be interested to hear your answer nonetheless. Like, what are some of the major ideas and things that are kind of changing and impacting the world during this time that make people decide to move away from alchemy and embrace just chemistry more generally?
Honestly, the biggest thing is just development of technology. Like, the ability to, like, if you're, like, back in the day, a philosopher would just say something, right? They would just say something, and because they're rich and people respect them, usually people will buy it. Now, you have so much technology emerging that if someone doesn't believe you, they can actually just be like, maybe there's a way I can just test this claim to figure out if it's true or not. So the biggest change to chemistry, like, between alchemy and chemistry, is the idea of empiricism, which I believe is sort of proposed mostly by a guy named Francis Bacon. He's the guy that was like, knowledge is power. And empiricism is literally just, you have to believe it to see it, which is just this idea, and it's weirdly enough a new idea, like a new logic structure that says, next time someone makes a claim, if they cannot show you evidence of that claim, you should discount it, essentially, which like that small idea is the biggest, like, I think that is the most like impactful change to our knowledge of like science and spirituality, and how the two become like separated from each other.
Totally.
One other thing, also, language. Like people are like translation of language. The world being able to become more unified and work together and compare notes as well. So that as well, different cultures coming together to be able to like, hey, wait, this idea is not right, and this idea is. Let's fix things.
Right, and I mean it's interesting too, because even now, like you're absolutely right, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later. Because you're absolutely right that, like, you know, technology and the scientific method are tools that can be used to test and to independently verify. But it's interesting that even till today, you know, all you have to do is put a scientist's name on something, and then suddenly people will just believe it, regardless, without actually, you know, going back and cross-referencing to make sure that it's actually veracious.
And that's so ironic, because science was the thing that was supposed to destroy, like, blind belief. But now, if you pay off a scientist to just say, like, oh, yep, I believe with this, people would just be like, well, he's a scientist, he wouldn't lie. And so, like, ironically enough, now it's, like, take global warming, right? How many companies pay off scientists to be like, oh, no, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, like, what ExxonMobil did in the 70s, like, they knowingly that, like, you know, that the science was in support of anthropogenic climate change, they paid off, you know, scientists to say what they wanted them to say, to be a mouthpiece for corporate consumption. And
listen, they've known. I went online and I saw an article from, like, I think it was like 1780 or maybe it was 18 something. It was basically like right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There was a paper that literally said, like, hey, I think it's fine now, but all this, like, excess like pollution, like especially with carbon dioxide, might cause temperature increase in a few hundred years. We knew this stuff so long ago, and somehow to this day we have corporations that are benefiting from it, that are just like, oh, well, it's new to me, so they can plead ignorance.
Totally.
Just drives me insane. Drives me.
And we can get in, and I have no doubt that we'll get into that. But first, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the like major and inspiring chemists of the world?
Okay. Yeah, well, the first one, and I think the most, like, the one that I think a lot of listeners will probably know, because if you've taken chemistry in high school or college, you've definitely heard of this guy, Antoine Lavoisier. He is, he's considered the father of modern chemistry. So if that, you know, lends any credence his way, he was a French nobleman. He was also a chemist. Obviously, that's why we're talking about him. Now, he had his fingers in a lot of pies. I will say, first and foremost, the guy was a humanitarian, which is really cool. He was really, really focused on improving water quality in France, which I think is probably how he got into a lot of wet chemistry, which I'll go over later. He really, really thought that the French prison system was deplorable, and he did a lot to improve hygienic conditions, because he felt that the conditions of prisoners was cruel and was not a great, effective way of rehabilitating like people into society. Gee, I'm seeing a parallel here. But yeah. And so what's interesting, he was also really interested in air quality, and particularly the effects that gunpowder had on air, which is probably the biggest, most important part, because at this time, there is a weird theory going around called phlogiston theory. And it's a really, really strange concept. And basically, you know, when you set something on fire, you see fire, right? Nowadays, we know that that's just energy. That's just energy being given off in the form of heat and light. But back in the day, people thought that fire was a byproduct of some special material that was being released when you burned something. And we called that material phlogiston. It was like a fire-like liquid substance that was released when combustible matter, or when I say combust, just something you can light on fire, essentially. When that matter was combusted, it released phlogiston. And so if you had a material that you had burned, you would call it dephlogisticated, which is a ridiculous word. So, like, if I burn coal, I'm left with dephlogisticated coal. And in fact, it's super similar to the four elements theory, whereas everything is made up of earth, fire, wind, and water, and those things can escape from whatever material is in there. It's the same thing with phlogiston. Now, here's the thing. If, in fact, phlogiston exists, if you were to burn something and it releases a bunch of elements, or the secret element called phlogiston, when you weigh that element, it should weigh less than when it initially did, right? Because it's losing a bunch of material as you burn it. Well, so what Antoine Lavoisier did was he and his wife developed an experiment where basically they took phosphorus, ironically enough, the first element discovered, and they combusted it in a sealed like glass container. And they waited before and they waited after. And what's really interesting is after they waited, it actually was heavier, which doesn't make sense because if phlogiston, the thing that makes compounds burn or elements burn, if it comes from within and is getting released, it should always weigh less. But this new compound that he had created weighed more. So he realized that maybe it's something in air and not in elements. Like maybe it's something in air that makes things combust. And in fact, until this point, we thought that air was a pure substance. And he thought maybe air isn't a pure substance. Maybe it's made up of different elements. And we now know that it is. Air is a mixture of like oxygen and nitrogen and some carbon dioxide and some water vapor. So that was a huge deal because he essentially disproved like the fact that like he disproved air as a pure substance. Now, around this time, there was a guy named Henry Cavendish, and he was I guess I can't call him I'll call him a scientist. He was an English scientist, and he did something really crazy. He realized that you could create water by combining what he called inflammable air with dephlogisticated air, which is essentially air that has yet to be filled with phlogiston. Again, very weird terms, very strange terms. Now, Lavoisier repeated this experiment, but because he now understands that air is not like air are different concentrations of different elements, he realized that inflammable air and dephlogisticated air, those are actually two elements. And so he renamed those two elements hydrogen and oxygen. So this guy essentially, I can't say he discovers oxygen but he names it oxygen. And so, by the way, hydrogen actually, if you think of like the term genes, right, creation, hydro is water. So hydrogen actually means water creator. So anyway, he names it hydrogen and oxygen, and it disproves water as a pure element as well. So air and water have now been disproven because of this guy's experiments. And so you can see empiricism taking root here. You see a chemist saying like, hey, I tested this. I can repeat this experiment. I can show you evidence that this theory is incorrect and blah, 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 blah. And so that is where chemistry is like essentially birthed by this guy. Now, he writes a book called Treatise on, it's like Chem de Trait or something. It's like a treatise on chemistry, essentially. Right. And in this treatise, based off his research, well, one, he lists 55 new elements that he discovers using a lot of his newfound chemistry, like chemical methods. But the three big things that he says are this. Phlogiston does not exist. Matter is made up of elements and not these four classical elements. Like it's made up of actual pure substances. And that he's realized that matter itself can never, ever be created or destroyed. It can only like change hands, essentially, or be reformulated into different elements and compounds. So that's, the law of conservation of mass, that's him. So that's everything that he contributed to science is right there. He did some more stuff. Now, I will say, as for every good thing he did, there are a few things that I don't necessarily agree with. So there's something pretty famous, and I bet a lot of your listeners are a lot more well-versed in this than I am, because I don't know a whole lot about, like, social sciences, but I know a lot about chemistry. But in France, there was something being developed called the Ferme Générale, and I don't know if that is how to pronounce it, but it basically is called the General Farm. That's what it is in English. It was a tax farm, essentially. And he invested in this tax farm. In return, he became a tax collector. Okay, and this is the 1700s, by the way. Okay, so if you have any understanding of France in the 1700s, this is not going to end well for Antoine Lavoisier. He did in fact, he commissioned a wall around Paris, like to be built around Paris, solely for collecting import and export taxes.
Jesus fuck. So
another thing about the General Farm is it had a monopoly on tobacco. It was like the sole producer of tobacco in France. And Lavoisier, he improved upon their recipe by adding a very small percentage of water to the tobacco mix. It was said to improve the taste. I will say, this is kind of cool, because as a result, for every 17 I think it was 6% water now, but for every 17 ounces of tobacco that the General Farm would deliver, they would only charge 16 ounces. Because, hey, we're selling tobacco, we're not selling water, so we're only going to charge you for the tobacco. So I'm not going to lie, that's actually like a very weird, like a weirdly honest business practice, which is like, what the fuck? How'd that happen? But again, Lavoisier, I think at the end of the day, he truly was a man of the people, and I think he really did believe in taxation as an important aspect of like social government. But I think he didn't understand how corrupt the tax system was at the time, or maybe he was just willfully ignorant. Who knows? Another thing that he did, he became commissioner of gunpowder, of like French gunpowder, and his knowledge of chemistry helped ensure very, very high quality French gunpowder. Now, another thing that he did was kind of gross. Was he married a 13-year-old daughter of one of the General Farm senior members. He was 26 at the time, and she was 13. Now, I will say, and at the time, that's probably pretty normal. But, when you look back, it's just like, ooh, yuck.
Yeah.
There's a yuck factor there. Her name was, I don't know her original last name, but her name's Marianne Lavoisier now. Now, I will say, this girl she's a bad bitch. She's super fucking cool. First off, she was trained in the arts by fucking Jacques-Louis David, who's a really, really famous painter of the time. Any students of art history are going to know this guy who's listening, which I think is so cool. Again, history and chemistry, being married. Now, what's cool is she used her her artistic talents to accurately draw models of Antoine's experiments. So she would basically be in the lab. Everything he was doing, she would accurately make models and illustrations of to help the layman understand the chemistry involved. Not only that, but she was an editor and a translator for every report Antoine Lavoisier made about his experiments and his findings. She was writing it down, editing it, and translating it so that other languages and other cultures could comprehend this progress in science. In fact, she also would translate texts from other societies so that Antoine Lavoisier could stay abreast of what was going on in the world. So this girl, honestly, she plays such a big hand in Antoine's success. But obviously, she was a woman, and because of history, you don't really when you hear about Antoine Lavoisier, you don't hear much about Marianne except that they got married, which I think is a shame because she's pretty fucking dope. She's just a super cool person, very talented. So anyway, you know what happens? The Reign of Terror occurs in 1770 or something, maybe 1780. I don't remember. But the French Revolution occurs. Unfortunately, because of his work with the General Farm, he was a tax collector. He gets arrested. Now, here's what's interesting. The court is, the court is a little corrupt. The court that is doing this. They accuse him of watering down the tobacco, which is true, but he defends it by saying it improved the quality of the tobacco, and he charged less for the tobacco because of it. But the thing is, the court dismissed that. They did not accept it as evidence because they knew that if they condemned the General Farm, they could seize all of its assets and they can increase their own wealth. So, this court that was created to for justice against unfair taxation is now doing the exact same thing, which is just fucked up. It's so fucked up. So anyway, because of this, he was found guilty and he gets guillotined. Oh, in fact, I heard that when he tried to defend himself, or maybe it might have been his wife that tried to defend him, the judge literally cut them off, and he was like, here's the thing, we have no need of science and chemists in our new society. All that matters is justice, which is fucking terrifying.
Christ.
That's the most terrifying thing I've ever... I fucking hope that's apocryphal, because... But anyway, he was guillotined, and so there's a guy named Joseph Lagrange. I think it's Joseph Louis Lagrange. He's a mathematician, and he does a lot of number theory. Any mathematicians will probably know of him. I bet Sam would know him, but anyway.
Sam is one of our mutual friends who we both are big admirers of the
Yes.
brain of.
I would not put it lightly when I say that the man is a genius when it comes to math. He truly understands it on such a deep level. Yeah, he brokers nothing but respect from us. And he's just a cool, funny fucking guy in general.
Also true.
Yeah, so Lagrange, he finds out about this, because he's French as well. He finds out about this guillotine, and he says it took them only an instant to cut off his head, and 100 years might not suffice to reproduce its like, which is really fucking poetic. He's just saying that, hey, even though it took them half a minute to just dismiss Antoine Lavoisier and kill him, but the kind of man he was and the kind of stuff, the research that he gave to the world and the information technology, again, it would take 100 years before we get such an important person. Which actually brings us to my next chemist, Marie Curie, who was born in the 1800s. So... do you want me to just jump right into it, or is there anything you want to speak on? Because I know you know a lot more about French society at the time than I do.
No, I mean it's interesting thinking about the way that I think a lot of people rush to thinking, especially lately, that the guillotine is somehow like a good thing, and that killing, if we just kill the right amount of people, then suddenly we'll be able to have a bright and beautiful and better future. And the people who say this are oftentimes incredibly into the idea that like socialism is actually scientific, and yet they seem to forget that the guillotine in the actual historical record was really a tool of bourgeois excess and like the triumph of liberalism, not like an actual meaningful like working class tool that was used to somehow liberate people more broadly. And so it's interesting hearing about like specifically how, again, like we were talking about earlier, like these vectors of history and science kind of coinciding in some really intriguing and fascinating ways.
Yeah, you know what you were saying about socialism being a science. What's the big Russian dictator?
Stalin.
Yeah, I want to say Stalin.
Well, are you talking about like Lysenkoism? That's Stalin, under Stalin.
Oh, okay. So at the time, Russia had like the worst crop failures in the history of the world.
Yeah, Lysenkoism.
Oh, that's it then?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. By the guy, that's the guy's name. Yeah. It was basically like the idea that certain plants have better genes that we should look for. He felt that was too similar to like, it was not socialist enough or something like that.
Yeah, like the genetics, like it was too close to genetic eugenics,
right.
Which is like, like on the one hand, like eugenics is terrible, but like also like plants and agriculture are totally different than breeding humanity. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's so different. There's no social aspect to it. It's just science. And but because he thought it was just not socialist enough, I guess. He was like, fuck this research, and so he got that other guy on it, and I just think that's like the funniest story. Like, one, it's also tragic, but kind of funny.
It is deeply tragic, but it's one of the, I think, and it's one of the interesting, again, vectors of the sort of excesses of thinking that there's this programmatic way to human like happiness and liberation, when in reality it's like something that we're gonna have to like work through and struggle for and try and fight for. So, but regardless, tell me about Marie Curie.
Yeah. Okay. So Marie Curie, I love Marie Curie. She's like one of the most inspirational people ever. So she was born in 1867, which is important. I want you to I'm gonna try and keep that date on the mind because it's an important date. But she's born in 1867. She was born in Poland, I think Warsaw. Now, this is while I believe it was a part of like the Russian Empire, which I think had like Russia, like Prussia, Poland. So one cool thing, her family's like, she grew up very impoverished because her family had spent like all of their fortunes supporting like radical uprising to try and restore Poland's independence. So right off the bat, I'm liking this girl and I like her family. Like, yeah, they shit on, like an empirical, tyranny. So I really like that that's how she gets her start, which I think is going to inform a lot of her like ideas of culture later on. So anyway, her mother and father were both teachers, which is fucking dope. Her father, like, I believe he taught a lot of science and math courses, but the Russian Empire eliminated science education in like secondary schooling in Poland. So like you have this big empire that's crushing other smaller states under heel, and then taking away their knowledge so that they can never like rise back up. Isn't that the fucking worst thing you ever heard? Like,
totally
drives me insane. But anyway, so what's cooler though is that he was like, well, fuck that, and he takes all of like the laboratory equipment home and all the books and texts, and he just starts teaching his kids all this stuff. So all of his kids, like, Marie, obviously, she becomes well-versed in science later on. One of her sisters ends up becoming, like, a pretty big mathematician, I think. I can't remember. But anyway, that's sort of how Marie Curie gets her start in science education, is this private schooling from her father. Now, when it comes time for her to join, like, a college-level education, well, here's the thing. Unfortunately, women are not allowed to further their education at the university level at the time. They're just simply not allowed. So that's fucking just so fucked up. And And even if they could, I don't know if they could learn like how much laboratory science they could learn or not. But what's cool though is that Curie. Oh, I'm sorry, her last name is not Curie at the time. It's Sklodowski, but I'm not going to remember that, so I'll just call her Marie for now. So Marie and her sister, what they end up doing is they find out about something cool, and I bet you've heard of this before, and I bet a lot of your listeners heard of this because you guys are more well versed in this stuff than I am. But they enrolled in the Flying University. And I don't know, you ever heard of that?
No, I actually haven't. What is that?
Dude, it's the coolest fucking thing. It was an underground educational network, and it operated out of like homes and old buildings in Poland. And it was basically just saying anyone should be able to learn. And so it was teaching everyone at this university. And people would have to pay to go there, but it was literally just to pay for like the cost of you know keeping away from authorities and everything, and being able to keep purchasing new content. So it was super fucking cool. And what happens whenever the authorities would get wind of this university, they would just pack up and set up shop elsewhere. And that's why they call it the Flying Universities, because they're flying around Poland, setting up shop to teach like anyone that can't get an education the legal way. So like I think that is just one of the coolest things I've ever heard of in history.
Yeah, that rocks.
Yeah, it's so dope. So anyway, after she learns quite a bit about like from the Flying University, she ends up moving to Paris. I think with her sister and her brother. But anyway, she moves to Paris and she attends the University of Paris. She gets a legitimate like legal education at the University of Paris. She gets her degree in physics. So technically, I guess she's not even a chemist, she's a physicist. But physics and chemistry, the more you go through history, they're the same thing basically. So anyway, this is where she's introduced. Again, she's Mary Sklodowski at this point, but she's introduced to Pierre Curie, who is a fellow physicist. So you know they develop they both love science, and they fucking develop nerd love over it. And he proposes to her, but she rejects him because she wants to move back to Poland because she believes that now that she's got an official degree and she's proven herself, that Poland will allow her to work as a university, because she has this notion that maybe Poland's progressed, a bit since she left. So she goes back to Poland, visits her family. She gets rejected. She gets denied a job at a university in Poland. I think it's one in Warsaw. But she gets denied because she's a woman. That's it. No other reason. Literally, just go, oh, you're a girl. It doesn't really matter that you've proven that you're as smart as anyone else. You're a girl. So, fucked up. She says, fuck this, and she comes back to France. She gets her fucking PhD. She gets a job as a professor, and she fucking marries the man that she loves. So, hell yeah, go Marie Curie. So, what I like here is you see a girl that she's patriotic in that she really loves her home country, but she's not fucking nationalist, you know? She loves her home country, but she also is immediately aware of how fucking stupid the country is. And she's like, fuck this, I'm out of here. I'm not going to support this bullshit. So she goes to France, which is, at the time, probably one of the most progressive areas, I would say. She gets her PhD, gets a job as a professor, marries Pierre Curie. So far, so good. Well, in the 1890s, so this is late 1800s, there's a guy named Wilhelm Röntgen, and he discovers the X-ray, okay? Which is a big deal, okay? So X-ray is basically, I don't know how well versed you are in energy, but essentially all energy on what we call the electromagnetic spectrum, there's a bunch of different types of energy, and the way you distinguish them is by their wavelength and their frequency. So wavelength is just the distance between two successive waves of a type of energy. It's all, a bunch of ridiculous stuff. But essentially, one of those new types of energy that's discovered is an X-ray. Now, this guy, Röntgen, he has no idea how X-rays are produced. He has no idea. But later on, a guy named Henry Becquerel, I think his name is, he notes that there's a specific salt. And I don't know if salt is just a compound of one metal bonded to some sort of non-metal or some ion, basically. But anyway, a salt that contains uranium seems to give off very similar rays. So it's a salt that contains the element uranium. So Marie Curie gets really interested in this because this is very new technology coming out, and she decides to research this salt. And she realizes that even though the salt is composed of a bunch of elements, the only part of the salt that is responsible for X-rays is the uranium itself. And the more uranium in the salt, the more X-rays. So this is a big deal because here's the thing. Normally, at this time, our knowledge of chemistry is that the only time energy is produced is when an element and another element react. So the only time we ever see energy being given off is by elements interacting with each other to form bonds, so chemical reactions. But this specific type of energy, this X-ray, it is being given off by a single element. Not a bunch of elements, a single element, which is never before seen, ever. This is totally new science. So she's like really interested. And her husband, he gets interested too, because he's like, holy shit, you're onto something. I think he was researching crystals at the time, but he was like, fuck this. I'm going to support my wife because she is onto some new science. So anyway, they end up studying other minerals that contain similar rays. And they end up isolating 2 elements from these minerals. One of them is named polonium. They named polonium because, well, Marie Curie is from Poland, so she names the element after her motherland, polonium, which is cool. The other element they name after radium, after rays themselves, like radium. And they also note something really interesting. They researched this and they realized that radium seems to destroy like cancer-ridden cells faster than normal cells do. So theoretically, if you were to bombard someone with radium, you could destroy their cancer before you destroy their body. And if that sets in motion the entire concept of chemotherapy, is like destroying a lot of the body to make it better. So like, this is a huge deal. Now, this is what I love, okay? During World War I, it hits. And, France is obviously engaged in World War I. And so Marie Curie, she's like, you know what? I love France now. Fuck Poland. I love France. And so anyway, she's supporting France and like in the military. And so what she does is she develops these mobile radiography units, which essentially they're just like these essentially like, when you go to the hospital and you get an X-ray to see if anything's wrong with your bones or whatever. This is just a mobile version that can easily be like sent to like the front lines to quickly take X-ray images of like wounded soldiers to assist in their treatment, basically. They called them Little Curies because, well, Marie Curie, which I think is really cute. Now, after that, so she establishes the first military radiology center ever, and she becomes director of the Red Cross, the radiology unit, because, well, she's the only one that really knows about radiology. She's the one that essentially invented all of this, research all this stuff. So that's like those are a part of her big contributions to science is essentially, the discovery of like, I guess radioactivity really. Or at least researching what X-rays are, how they form, and understanding that elements themselves can give off energy as opposed to molecules. Now, here's the thing. I think her husband died. He got hit by a car, but her death was a bit more tragic. So the thing is, no one really understood how damaging like ionizing radiation is. And well, that was all Curie worked with. She had a very, very small working work quarter, and so her close proximity to like so much radioactive material, it ends up causing like all these chronic illnesses. And I think she was like blind near the end. I think she had like some tumors. She had some bone cancer. I want to say I don't actually know that last part. I think she did, and it ends up resulting in her death, which is really like a shame. But it's ironic because we wouldn't know if it was dangerous unless someone researched it, and she happens to be the one who researched it. But I mean, I will say, like, I'm talking, she took test tubes with like radioactive isotopes. She just had them in her pocket. She would just walk around the house, like like looking at them in her pocket. She stored this shit in her desk drawers. Like, she would just look at it. She even like wrote down like, "Hey, it glows in the dark. That's pretty dope." Like, I honestly see her like in the dark, being like, "Oh, I can't read this fucking text. Oh, wait, I know," and then take a fucking vial of uranium or something or polonium and just like using it as a match. But anyway, what's really interesting is to this day, all of her paperwork, all of her journals, even her cookbook, it's all sealed in this giant like lead vault. Essentially, it's in a bunch of lead-lined boxes. And anyone who to this day wants to consult her research without using the internet, but maybe back in the day they didn't have the internet, they have to go in, they have to wear these protective like suits, basically like these hazmat kind of suits, and they have to get like sprayed down just to open this lead box and read some notes. So it's this weird shrine to Marie Curie's work that is protected by these lead-lined containers, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, that's super fucking rad.
Yeah. Last thing to say about her, this is super cool. She is the first woman to ever win a Nobel Prize. And she's the first person and only woman to win the Nobel Prize twice in 2 different scientific fields. The reason that I wanted you to remember that date is because I want to talk about another person named Fritz Haber. He is kind of on the opposite spectrum of Marie Curie. I love Marie Curie to death. Fritz Haber, not so much. Now, Marie Curie was born in 1869. Fritz Haber, born in 1869. These two, as I see this, you're going to notice these two are almost mirror, like, they're almost, like, they're opposites. They're mirror images, but also... Yeah. So, first off, I'm not going to go into his home life. It's not that exciting, but his big contribution, okay? The first big thing he does, and I'm not going to lie, I'm going to give him props for this. He developed a method for creating artificial fertilizer, okay? That's a huge deal. So one of the key ingredients in fertilizer is ammonia, which is NH3. So it's nitrogen with 3 hydrogens bonded to it. Now, until he did this, ammonia could literally only be extracted from natural reserves, basically. So you had to find it and hope it didn't get depleted, okay? So it could not sustain growing populations, and that's sort of the 1900s was growing population, and the 1800s. So what he did was he took hydrogen and nitrogen gas, and he subjects them to like this immense pressure and heat. And what happens is he literally just like the pressure and heat literally just forces them to like just stick together, basically. And so nitrogen and hydrogen, because of the difference in pressure and heat, they form NH3, which is ammonia. So suddenly ammonia can be created using some of the most abundant elements on Earth, because nitrogen and hydrogen, if you breathe in, you're breathing in nitrogen and hydrogen. So it's very easy to get your hands on these elements. And so now it's super easy to make fertilizer. And this work has literally prevented billions of people from starvation. He was awarded a Nobel Prize for this work, and he was deserving of it. Like, this is some good science here. However, just like with Marie Curie, World War I comes around, and this is where you see the darker side of Fritz Haber. So when World War I hits, he's German, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. He is German, if you couldn't tell by the name. He lends his scientific capabilities to the war effort. Like, he dives in. In fact, he famously, here's like a famous quote from him, and I don't know if I'm getting this right, but I kind of just wrote it myself. He said, "During peacetime, the scientist belongs to humanity, but during times of war, he belongs to the fatherland." And if that's not the most nationalistic bullshit you ever heard, like, oh, that just stinks. So anyway, so the first thing he does is, I don't know if have you ever heard of the Manifesto of the 93?
I don't think so.
It's basically it's basically a declaration of 93 like scientists and scholars and artists in German, and they're basically a giant declaration that they sign saying that they're in support of the German military and they're supporting what Germany is doing, which is pretty gross. And so what he does is he ends up spearheading the development of chemical weaponry for Germany. He gets a pretty cushy gig doing that. Okay, so he helps develop chlorine gas, phosphine, or is it phosgene? I can never remember. I think it's phosgene gas, and mustard gas. Mustard gas is pretty famous, okay, right? I think it's sulfur-based, kind of a yellowy substance. Chlorine gas, you never want to inhale. If you ever heard the term, don't mix like ammonia and bleach, or not ammonia. Ammonia and bleach, because you'll release chlorine gas. If you actually, you might have. Do you remember Breaking Bad, the first season, when Walter is being forced to cook by those two like gangsters? I think Crazy 8 is one of them.
Yeah, and he like uses it to kill one of them.
Yeah, the thing the gas he made was phosphine gas. So isn't that fucking gnarly?
Yeah, it is.
So because of his like how like this technology, Fritz Haber is considered the father of chemical warfare, which is like, that is not a name to be proud of.
No.
First off. He also developed specialized gas masks that could like filter out the poisonous gas that he developed. So like, I don't know, like, you know how in Fallout, like the big aesthetic is always someone wearing a gas mask and like a big trench coat and like a gun.
Right.
That's this basically. It's pretty much based off of this guy. In fact, he formed like a special military troop composed specifically of scientists that he knew could carry out could distribute these chemical bombs and grenades like with the utmost efficiency. So he has this weird German like military unit full of scientists that are all wearing these like creepy trench coats and like gas masks. And among that group is Otto Hahn, who, along with a girl named Lisa Meitner, they would actually discover nuclear fission, which it's a whole story for another day, but that's a big deal. Now, anyway, one thing that sucks is he was there, like he personally was on the battlefield to witness the first deploying of this chemical warfare, and he recorded it, and he was super proud of himself. So he goes home and he tells his wife all about it. Well, here's the thing. His wife is a women's rights activist. She's a pacifist. She had recently lost her job, apparently. So she was struggling with a lot of depression. She was struggling with Germany's like very new recent warmongering culture, which she thought was just really, really, it was very upsetting. And so she finds out what he did, and he's like laughing about it and just so happy with like how many people he killed. And he's describing in great detail like how they died, because like that shit's nasty. When you like chlorine gas, it reacts with something in your lungs that releases water, and so literally you just choke to death. Like your lungs, you just drown in your own lung fluid basically because of chlorine gas. Not enough of that, you can go blind, you can get blisters, you can burn. Like it's horrible. And so he's just like super proud of it. She ends up committing suicide over it. She literally just shoots herself because she cannot believe like what's happening to her country. And I just think that's so fucking tragic. And he ends up marrying someone else afterwards. So obviously he didn't care too much, I'm assuming. So I don't like this guy. The more I read about him, the worse he gets.
Jeez.
But I will say he gets a comeuppance. And I don't know how great it is, but after the war, okay, this is during, Germany is lost and they're facing a lot of post-war repercussions, and they're going into debt, and everything is like living standards are just tanking in Germany. And Fritz Haber notices that there's a growing anti-Semitic culture in Germany. A lot of people begin to blame Jews for some weird reason, because Jews seem to be associated with wealth and money, and since there's no money going around, people are going to blame the Jews. Now here's the thing: Fritz Haber was born into a Jewish family, and even though I think he changed religions, he was really, really, really afraid that his Jewish heritage would be dug up. So he puts himself into self-exile, okay? So he leaves Germany before the war starts. So I think I don't know when he gets out, like maybe 1920s, I don't know. But he gets out before the war actually starts. Well, here's the thing. Before all this happens, when he was still researching like agrarian sciences and developing fertilizer, he ended up developing an insecticide, okay? And he names this insecticide Zyklon A. Now, I bet people listening are already like, holy shit. But anyway, after he leaves, a company ends up buying this research, and they develop an even more effective insecticide, which they rename Zyklon B. And Zyklon B, that pesticide or insecticide, that is the gas used in Holocaust, like gas chambers, like concentration camps. So the exact same gas. Oh, and many of Fritz Haber's own family, they have been recorded, like they are known to have died in concentration camps. So it's likely that his own family died from the very gas that Haber himself fucking developed. He made this gas for his country that he loved so much and he supported during the war, and this country turns on him because fucking nationalism is fucking stupid. He leaves, and his own family dies, and they get killed by the exact technology he researched and developed.
It's wild.
And that's the end of Fritz Haber. Like that's his end.
Oof, that's some heavy. I wouldn't call it poetic justice because he didn't.
No, I couldn't. I can't say it. It's too tragic, and honestly, he escaped. So really, I mean, I'm sure he felt bad, but
yeah, it's fucking psychotic, and
But
oof.
Can you see any like parallels between him and Marie Curie?
Yeah, I mean, totally.
Yeah, what's interesting is you see Marie Curie get denied by her nation, and so she says, "Fuck it, I'm gonna support a different nation that accepts me for who I am." And then you see the opposite here. You see this like white dude who is obviously accepted in society. He rises in the ranks of the military. He loves his country. He loves fighting for them, and then they fucking just turn on him. Like, it's, I don't know. There's so much to those two stories.
I mean, nationalism is a brain cancer, dude. It
is, dude. It is. It's luckily Marie Curie has enough radium to deal with it.
When we were preparing for this episode, you mentioned that there was a Russian chemist who also happened to be the founder of the periodic table and also happened to be an anarchist. Can you tell us a little bit more about this guy?
Yeah. That guy is like the Jesus of like, when you go to like a chemistry classroom, people love him. Like Dmitry Mendeleev is his name, and he was a Russian chemist, and this is like I wish I knew the date more, but this is around the time when we still had like czars, like there was still a Russian Empire. So basically, now I'm not gonna say like he was using information that a lot of people had already like, sort of come up with, and he realized that like all the elements that had been found, what he did is he began like trying to figure out a way to arrange them on the periodic table. There were a few scientists before him that realized that like certain elements have such similar properties, and like the properties are similar that they tried grouping the elements together. Well, he did something very similar. Dmitry Mendeleev, what he did was he took all the known elements, and he put them left to right by increasing order of atomic mass. And atomic mass is just like how much each individual element weighs. So like hydrogen weighs less than helium, helium weighs less than lithium, so on and so forth. So he put them all left to right. But then he did something else. He then he broke each like this giant like long row he had. He broke it off into individual rows, and he stacked those rows up so that elements with similar properties would appear underneath each other. So going left to right, he had increasing atomic mass, but going vertically, like up down, he had elements with similar properties grouped together. And he noticed that this pattern was working out so well, in fact, that he realized that, like, wait a minute, there are some, like, if this element goes here and this element goes here and here and here, he realized that as he was making this, like, this table, which would be the periodic table, he realized that there were some actual empty spaces. And he left those spaces empty because he was like, well, I can't put any of the elements any of the elements that we know that exist, we can't put them in that space because it wouldn't fit there. And so he basically made a guess that, like, in a few years, he guaranteed that someone was going to find an element that belonged in that exact spot. It had the right weight, and it also had very similar properties to the elements above it and below it. And literally, within 3 years, someone discovered the element, I want to say gallium. It was either gallium or germanium, maybe both. And those elements fit in the exact spots that he predicted they would. So people, initially people, like, they sort of dismissed his idea because another guy had tried to do something very similar where he tried to arrange elements based off of, like, music scales, and people thought that was ridiculous. So people dismissed him as well. But now, when that happened, people were like, holy shit, this guy's on to something. And you know, so the model that he had, it was rearranged a little bit. Like, now we use increasing atomic number, which is like the number of protons in an element. But at its core, the system that he used, we essentially use that system to this day. So Dmitry Mendeleev, I mean, he's such an important figure in chemistry. And what's cool about him on his social life, I don't know a whole lot about his social life. I heard he could be kind of grumpy, but one cool thing was that I believe he taught at a college, and, you know, at the time, people were super upset at the Russian, you know, with Russian, like, empirical policies, and so he was always supporting, like, all these anarchist clubs on school, and so he's basically a self-styled anarchist, which is fucking cool, which I love. Now here's what's kind of funny. So, and this could be again apocryphal. I actually read this from a book that I was recently reading about the guy's life, but apparently, Mendeleev liked to get a little freaky, and he actually had a girl on the side, like, he, you know, of his wife. So he had a mistress, and apparently the Russian Tsar, like, this was a big no-no in Russia at the time, but the Russian Tsar was like, I'm gonna let it slide, and people were like, why? And he was like, well, here's the thing, Dmitry Mendeleev might have 2 wives, but I only have one Dmitry Mendeleev, because he was aware of, like, how fucking valuable this guy was as a scientific asset. So here's the thing: the Russian Tsar is willing to forgive Mendeleev for a lot of shit, but once he found out that Mendeleev was basically, like, involved in a bunch of these anarchist like protests, he stripped him of his rank at the college, and so he fired the guy. Not that he mattered, because at this point Dmitry Mendeleev is rolling in it. Like, he is the most famous guy at the moment in the realm of science. The periodic table, because the periodic table is the accumulation of everything we have been talking about. Every element, like every story of history, intrigue, drama, scientific discovery, like, of every nation. It all comes together to form this periodic table. Like, if people always ask me, like, if our world unified and we, like, lived under one flag, what would that flag be? It would be, no one asked me that. Why am I saying that? No one has ever asked me that. But if I asked myself that flag would be the fucking periodic table, because the periodic table is the best representation of how humanity has come together to form something great and better than, like, our individual selves.
Fuck yeah. Well, I might be biased, but every time you and I sit down and talk about the history of chemistry and science more generally, we continually seem to kind of return to this notion that science is inherently rebellious. And so my question for you is, like, how does the scientific method, which is a relatively, straightforward kind of idea, propel human discovery and inquiry, and how does it inspire us to challenge dogmatic ideology and insubstantiated authority?
Well, I mean, because the thing is, dogmatic ideology is based off of superstition itself. That's like, I mean, or at least it has, pre-developed policies that they want to use religion to institute, sort of thing. But the thing is, the more we understand empiricism, the more that we have this idea of like, no, you got to prove it, and we have to be able to experiment in it. Because like all science, like what science is it's a method to explain natural phenomena. Like that's a very simple way to define science, but that's what it is. And so, if someone is trying to tell you something that you can literally, like, if you can use science to disprove it, then you do. And so by its nature, if people in power are telling you lies, and science is by its definition the search for truth, it's going to be rebellious because it's rebelling against false truth. It's rebelling against falsehoods. Like, for instance, I mean, let's take like some early pseudosciences that were very quickly quelched once the actual scientific method was developed. Phrenology, right? The idea that you can feel a person's skull to determine if they're going to be a good person or a bad person or whatever. I mean, that was used as a quote unquote legitimate science to keep black Americans down for so long during slavery. Basically scientists were saying, hey, black people, their skull, it has this very specific conformation, and that specific conformation, it tells us that actually black people aren't very good at living their own lives. And so we, as the white man, are doing them a service by ensuring, that we lead them. And so, like, how shitty is that? But, like, all it takes is a very, very, very quick implementation of the scientific method to be like, yeah, that's bullshit, dude.
And it's interesting because you can see how, like, those kinds of things, like, naturally lead towards this kind of tension, right? And this is the thing that I kind of want to dig into with you is, like, there's this idea, right, that on the one hand, science is a appliance that can, emancipate and free our minds, and yet at the same time, it's so often used as a tool to bludgeon and to be misused and to substantiate, illegitimate forms of authority. And I guess one of the things that I'm kind of interested in is, the blind adherence to science can pose some really dangerous examples, and maybe a grand example, but I'm hard pressed to think of a better illustration of the dangers of science and technology than the atom bomb, right?
Oh yeah, totally. Because here's the thing. Yeah, I mean, it's like Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power, and those in power would like to maintain their power. So, like, yeah, and if science is a means of amassing power, even though it's also a means of creating a veritable paradise, people in power will utilize it for their own ends. And yeah, the nuclear bomb is a prime example because, well, first off, history tells us that, Japan, they have this Bushido culture and they'd never surrender, so we need to use the bomb. But the more we learn about history, the more we realize that, Japan was probably going to surrender. So like the bomb itself, if it wasn't actually a means of ending the war, you can really only think of it as a means of America just saying like, hey, look what we can do. Right. When in the coming years, treat us the way you should be treating us because we have this ability to decimate you. So it's really just it's a fucking power play by America that cost millions of lives. But the thing is, the atom bomb it is based off of what could be a really wonderful technology. Like nuclear technology, you take a nuclear reactor and you get the science right, and you could have some of the cleanest energy that the world has ever seen. I should say the cleanest and most efficient energy the world has ever seen. It could single-handedly replace like our electricity, coal, and it would be so much cheaper. You know what? Like the only byproduct of like a nuclear reactor is water. It's just water vapor. No, not coal, no CO2, no nothing, no pollutants, just water vapor. Obviously the stuff itself is irradiated, but you can store that in you could store that in a big giant lead brick, throw it in the ocean, and you got yourself a fucking coral reef. But again, like technology, and I will say, okay, technology is also advanced by those with the money, willing to spend the money on technology. And who has more money than like warmongers? And so a lot of technology we develop starts in war and ends in like something better. Like take sonar, right? The only reason we researched sonar was because of like our submarines. Now sonar is used for something fucking great, and now nuclear power can be used for something great. But it had its beginnings in such a horrible application, I guess.
Totally. Well, I guess that kind of gets into this interesting kind of realm of us thinking about, like, you know, the potential of the ways in which the scientific method can actually still be used to create positive types of engagement, right? And I'm not super interested in, you know, the whole conjecture of quote unquote scientific socialism, but I am interested in the more broad questions of like the kinds of things that the scientific method can do in order to like get us to think critically and to get us to interrogate the foundations of our ideological predispositions, right? And you know, even in our current day, like pseudoscience is incredibly pervasive. If anything, it's even more pervasive, and it's funny that, you know, we carry around like veritable libraries of Alexandria in our pockets, and yet we still can't seem to break free of the shackles of pseudoscience. And my question for you, as you know, as a scientist and as a educator, you know, why do you think pseudoscience has had such a lasting power and has such lasting saliency, or rather lack thereof, in the popular imagination?
You know, one of the things, and this is going to sound I feel like this is going to sound a little condescending and dismissive, but I think that there are a lot of people out there who feel like maybe they're living an unfulfilled life. You know, maybe people stuck in dead-end jobs, or they just feel like they can't progress anymore, and they feel like they're not a unique person, and they feel like they're not contributing what they should be contributing to the world, and getting back from the world what they're owed. And I think when you come across something, well, first off, pseudoscience is easy. Okay, by definition, it's always going to be a very simple science that does not take like years of study to understand. So if you are in a situation like that and you learn that there's this pseudoscience, well, you don't know it's pseudoscience, you think it's real. There's this theory that you seem to easily comprehend because it's geared towards the layman. One, you can easily understand it, and two, if you know something that other people don't, doesn't that just kind of weirdly make you feel a little bit more powerful and better? Like, don't you ever just love like dropping a fun fucking fact on people? The idea of pseudoscience, I think it makes people feel like they're onto some great conspiracy that the world's hiding, like flat earthers. They think that, you know, it's all controlled by the government to try and suppress our knowledge, and I think it makes them feel empowered, like they're a part of this resistance that's like, learn the truth, just like UFO abductee, you know. And you know, how many times have you met someone who's like super bohemian and is super into like crystal magic, like oh yeah, this like energizes my third chi crystal or whatever. It's because it's something that they feel like they can become an expert on very easily, and they don't have to like work very hard to research it. That's a big part of it, and I don't think that's the only part. I will say also some pseudoscience is you know, uses confirmation bias, or like it basically takes people's like preconceived notions. Like maybe like let's take a racist, right? A racist would probably really want to believe phrenology because it supports his idea that maybe a certain race is genetically inferior to him. So he'd probably really buy into phrenology. Or take early psychology, right? You've probably heard about like conversion therapy or aversion therapy, where they would take someone who's gay, strap them in a chair, and then they would show them like gay pornography and then make them vomit and like shock them and cut them, because they were trying to condition them to be against homosexuality by associating being gay with having like pain and vomiting and shock therapy and stuff. And if you're a homophobe, I mean, think about this, right? If you're a homophobe, you've probably heard of those like Pray the Gay Away centers and stuff like that. They do the exact fucking same thing. So yeah, I'd say there's two things, like a lack of faith within yourself, a lack of self-esteem that allows you to feel like you're suddenly very important for having understood this new science that isn't actually real, and using a pseudoscience to reinforce your either your racist views, or even using it to reinforce maybe some economic gain, like like climate change deniers. That's
Totally.
a perfect example. Yeah, perfect example.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of, I guess, the sort of intersections of conspiracy and conspiratorial thinking with broader questions of how people feel incredibly, alienated from one another, how they don't have a sense of community, they feel dispossessed, and so having something that they can latch on to and believe in and feel like they have that secret knowledge. I mean, it all makes sense, but it's all, if you ask me, it's all a specter and a holdover of the ways in which, capitalist ideology creates these conditions for people to be so incredibly separated from one another.
Yeah, you're right, and it just repeats, like a cycle that repeats itself too, and makes it worse with each iteration. It feels
totally, I mean, I think that says a lot about like why we're at, why we are where we are at.
I have a pretty good example. I have a girl in my class who she's not doing so hot in the class, which is a shame. She's not trying very hard, but I will say she knows so much about astrology, which is a pseudoscience. And she has kids that she'll form, groups will form around her, and they're like, oh, I'm a Pisces. Can you do me? And she's like, oh, you're a Pisces? Yeah, that means you're blank and blank and blank. And by the way, this planet is in this orbit, which means you're going to have a good day or something like that. And I can see that she feels really fucking empowered by having this group surround her as she explains her pseudoscience. And I was like, if you just learned real science, you could have that same, that same pride in your knowledge. And so yeah, that's just a good example of it.
Yeah,
but,
totally.
Sorry, continue.
No. I mean, it's the difference between having a materialist basis for your worldview or one that is rooted in a faith-based assumption about the operations of the cosmos.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, the last kind of thing that I want to touch base with you on is kind of a broader question, but I think it's an important one to end on. If you ask most teachers what they think their chief duty is, the first thing they'll tell you is that their job is to teach kids to think critically. And I know both you and I kind of subscribe to that kind of a teaching philosophy. So my question for you is, specifically to chemistry, to the history of chemistry, why is it that this marriage of the two helps students in a unique way to think and adapt critical thinking skills?
Well, you know what I think? I think a lot of kids inhibit their own ability to develop critical thinking because they truly believe, for some reason, that they just cannot do it. They have this weird notion that they're just not smart. Even though being smart means just literally opening a book and reading and writing down notes and stuff. That's all being smart is having an okay work ethic, basically. So when I like to give these kids a taste of the history of chemistry because I want to show them listen, we started off believing that if you eat lead you'll live longer. That's a legitimate thing that happened once. The entire Roman aqueduct system, the entire Roman water system was made using lead pipe. That was a stupid idea, but the point is we always learn from it. And so I try and give these these people real world examples because these are just real regular people that have been learning all their lives. And you're that person too. You're going to be learning all your life. So I think that helps show them that, hey, if this guy who ate lead ended up forming this theory, maybe I can do something too. I think, and I will say one of the things is chemistry is very math heavy. And what I like about chemistry is I think in a lot of math classes, you do you learn the equation, but you don't really know how it's applied in life. When I give them a chemistry equation, by definition, this equation is used to understand something in chemistry. We use something called stoichiometry, which is basically if I have X amount of hydrogen and X amount of oxygen, how much water could I make, basically? And that's a straight up real world example that I would use in a lab to produce the appropriate amount of chemicals. So every time I teach them something, I always trying to give them a real world example of how it's applied and a historical perspective of it, and just some sort of fun fucking trivia to keep them interested. Because that's really what critical thought is. It's caring about something enough to go past the sort of the novice level, right? It's caring about something to break past the tough barriers to get to that next level and really understand the core content. Just get someone invested enough to break past that initial confusion in the brain. Because really, a lot of people will tell me, it's like, Mr. Perry, like, I'm getting a headache trying to do this, but like, you know, if you do push-ups, your muscles are going to ache. And then guess what? You're going to get bigger muscles. The more resistance you meet in your brain and you push past that, that's your brain literally like developing like synapses and neural networks to understand this stuff. Your brain is literally improving the more challenging material you get. And that's what critical thought is. Like when you're developing critical thought, you're literally building your brain up.
Be a brain bodybuilder.
Yeah, brain bodybuilding. Get swole where it counts.
Oh, Jesus. Well, Taylor, I think that about does it for us, my friend. I mean, I really appreciate you coming on to Coffee with Comrades. I feel like I've kind of been doing the circle over the year and a half this podcast has been together, just kind of like inviting friends on the show and having conversations. And so I'm grateful that you agreed to come on the show. I know you genuinely truly give a shit about your students, and that's so important in the public school system that generally just wants to make nice little worker bees who will keep their heads down and won't ask any questions. So, you know, you do just the opposite. You encourage your students to question everything, and I think that the world would be a much brighter place if there were more teachers who subscribe to this kind of cross-disciplinary pedagogy that you adopt.
Well, thanks, man. I'm happy to be a comrade on the show.
Fuck yeah, dude. Well, listen, at any rate, can you tell folks where they can find more about these subjects? Do you have like any, recommendations for people to get plugged into if you're curious to learn more about chemistry and the history thereof?
Yeah, I know this sounds like the exact opposite thing that a teacher should ever say, but believe it or not, Wikipedia has a lot of great information. But just check the links to make sure it's backed up. Wikipedia is great. I will say one of the greatest books I've ever read is by a man named Sam Keen, who I think he actually does a podcast himself, but I can't remember. But anyway, Sam Keen wrote a book called The Disappearing Spoon and Other True Tales of Madness, Love, and the History of the World from the Periodic Table of Elements. It basically takes every single element on the periodic table and shows you what purpose they served in history and how it affected the planet afterwards, how it affected our human history. And it's just really, 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 really cool. So for instance, The Disappearing Spoon, the title itself, comes from a story of the metal gallium. Gallium's really interesting because at room temperature, it is a metal, but 1 degree above room temperature and it melts. So what a lot of chemists would do is they would invite people over for tea. I'm assuming this is in Britain or England. And they would give them a spoon to stir their hot tea made out of gallium. And then the gallium would just melt right in front of them. They're like, what'd you do? So it's just this. That's just one of 8 million amazing stories in this book. And I'm sure I might have gotten some of my info from this book. I don't really remember. It's been a while since I've read it. But yeah, I would highly recommend this book.
Is there anything you want to plug before I let you go?
Dude, I don't have any social media. I guess sometime you and I, if we also are on a podcast called Playing Out of Character.
Yep.
We just fucking play board games with friends. That's just fun. So if my voice was not particularly grating and you want to hear more of it,
especially more of it in a weird 1920s Bostonian
I do a weird
accent.
Transatlantic accent. Yeah, and I don't know how well it comes across, but
that's fine.
Whatever. Yeah. I don't really have any social media other than that. I don't really. So yeah, that's it.
Cool. Well, brother, take care. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you later.
Yeah, man. You too. Bye.
And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time.